Okay, so you ready? So you have a handout which is two important paragraphs. They're just paragraphs. You know Frege's wrestling with something when he writes these long paragraphs. This is the beginning of the paragraph from On Sense and Reference, Sinn und Bedeutung, or in Basque, who knows? Identity gives rise to challenging questions which are not altogether easy to answer. Is it a relation between objects, or between names or signs of objects? In my Begriffsschrift, I assume the latter. I think this must be the most read passage by Frege, because this essay has been assigned in virtually every philosophy of language class since about 1950, and most students at least read the first two sentences of their assignments, right? But it's got three sentences. 1, 2, no, 3, 4. Yeah, the fourth sentence is clearly false, which is kind of amazing. That's not what he said in the Begriffsschrift. He distinguished in the Begriffsschrift between identity of content, 3 bars. He got rid of the identity sign, 2 bars, but he uses the word identity. If A 3 bars B, then the relation identity of content holds between the signs A and B. So as he puts it there, there is a bifurcation in the meaning of all names. Almost always they stand for the objects, they refer to the objects, but in the presence of this sign, they refer to themselves. Weird. Seems vaguely non-compositional. On the other hand, he is facing up to a problem that is there. In the relation of, so for example, this number 20 there, that's what we would now call a fundamental principle of identity, or the indiscernibility of identicals. And you'd have 2 bars there, and you'd say C is identical with D, and you have F of C. This is, you all know Frege's notation. You teach that, don't you, Kappa? Yeah. So it's beautiful notation. The thing you care about is on the top, and the qualifications hang off below. So this says, if C has a 3-bar relation to D, the relation of co-reference or sameness of content, and in addition, if C has property F, or however you want to say that, then D has property F. Then his explanation, you can see, in the case in which content of C is identical with the content of D. So you have this whole phrase, the content of C, that refers to what C stands for. It has a relation of identity, for which he uses the word identical, to the content of D. So it makes sense. He's explaining the 3 bars in terms of identity. And it's perfectly clear, as you can see from some of the other derivations I've made in my... If you like Frege's notation, there is a program in LaTeX called Frege, and you can cut down even more on the readership of your articles by using it. Okay, so he definitely does not hold in the Begriffsschrift that identity is a relation between names. He just doesn't. Here's what he actually says in the Begriffsschrift, which is in your long thing. Identity of content differs from conditionality, if then, and negation, in that it applies to names and not to contents. I'm not claiming it's the clearest thing ever written, but it's pretty clear what he's aiming at. Whereas in other contexts, signs are merely representations of their content, so that every combination into which they occur expresses only a relation between the respective contents, they suddenly display their own selves from their combined by, I'm missing something here, but when they are combined, by the means of the signs for identity of content.
Just a quick note.
I'll bet. Yeah, go ahead.
No, really. That's why it's not mistaken for him to put F of C
Yeah.
and F of D. It's not a use mention.
No, because in f of c and f of d, c stands for the thing, yes. They suddenly displayed their own selves from their combined, whatever. Anyway, so a bifurcation in the meaning of all signs, that's a religious conception that Frege had about all of the, that should be the meaning of all signs. They stand at times for themselves and at times for their content, at times for this. Now by content, in the Begriffsschrift, he's just got expressions and references, Bedeutung, Bedeutungen. And those are contents. So the content of John Perry is me, not a sense of me or a function from possible worlds to obscurity or something like that. There's the table in the Begriffsschrift. You got expressions, names, relation words, or we call them concept words. I mean, this is not so long ago in years, but it's long ago in the history of logic. Relations were just being taken seriously. So Frege kind of had this great idea that concept words are incomplete, so that you don't have to worry about this, what's it called, the three things problem, you know, well, yeah, so you say A has property B, well, what's the has relation? Well, that's, well, you know, anyway, so it's kind of neat. And he says many times, all throughout his career, that concepts are relations and properties. But sometimes he hesitates with the relations because they were kind of new, and so he says they are kind of combinations of concepts. But anyway, so this is the basic thing. You've got expressions, relation words, I call them in this chart for some reason, sentences, relations, which he regarded as functions, but not as later functions to truth values, but functions to circumstances, which are a lot like what people now call states of affairs. And that term also comes up in the more obscure German philosophy of the same era. A circumstance is an object having a property or object standing in a relation, or a relation or a concept falling under a higher level concept. Great stuff from Frege. Maybe not the last word on all this stuff, but one of the first clear words. And this is the Begriffsschrift. Okay. Now, why did he give us section 8, where he bifurcates the meaning of all names? Well, because it looked to him like he had two problems. And I am illustrating both with Hesperus and Phosphorus, which he did not use. In this work, he uses A and B, capital A and B. On sense and reference, he uses little a and little b. In function and concept, he uses the morning star and the evening star. Those kind of look like names in German more than they do in English, where they look like incorrect, definite descriptions. So I just leap ahead 50 years to whenever Quine or whoever it was introduces Hesperus and Phosphorus as the official Fregean example. Hesperus and Phosphorus being the Babylonian names for the evening star, Hesperus, and the morning star, Phosphorus, which both turn out not to be a star, but the planet Venus, as I'm sure you know. So, observation 1 and 2 refer to the same circumstance. Remember, a circumstance has disappeared from his theory. Yeah. Okay, circumstance is just made up of things and relations, the things standing in the relation. And I should say a circumstance can either be a fact or not a fact. I think I'll leave it at that. So he noted that 1 and 2 on his theory refer to the same circumstance. That means they have the same content, which he called conceptual content. They have the same conceptual content. But you can learn something from 2 that you can't from 1. First problem, you can learn that the names Hesperus and Phosphorus co-refer. Footnote that I decided to add to irritate David. Nobody's ever solved this. Modern logic gets solved by a name, principle of substitution. Right? You look at a sentence that's about Hesperus and Phosphorus, and then you're allowed to substitute the names you see, one for the other. Why? That's not what it says. Because the teacher said so. End of irritating aside.
No, it's not the end of it.
Yes. This will be worked out in detail in my posthumous book, The Incompleteness of Completeness, which will be edited by David and Kepa, and written by Maria. Okay, but there's a second problem. Suppose that there are ways of determination associated with the names. Now, ways of determination, that sounds like modes of presentation. That sounds like sense and reference. Yes, but it's right there in the Begriffsschrift, in the long quote. In the long quote, he gives a geometric example. He likes geometric examples. That's very important if you want to understand Frege better than I probably ever will. And I'm not sure how it works, but you've got this line. Whoops. And that's point A. And then I'm not sure how he gets the diameter, but he picks a diameter. And then you have this line, and that's B. And as this goes this way, eventually you have A equals B. A needlessly complicated example for what I'm going to make with Hesperus and Phosphorus. But I have to give you a little background because his point here in the Begriffsschrift is that, yeah, these are arbitrary marks, and if that's all they were, you wouldn't really give a diddle about this relation. Who cares? But once the arbitrary marks have what he calls a mode or way of determination associated with them, then you not only learn that the names co-refer, but from that you get real knowledge. So so here I have to, in this postscripting era, kind of invent a story that will seem unlikely. But so the Babylonians, as it turned out, eventually discovered that this was about, when was it, David? 533 BC, October maybe? Yeah, okay. They discovered that the morning star and the evening star were both planets. But they didn't know they were the same planet. And they were very scrupulous, these Babylonians, so when a child got to be 7 years old, they would take them out in the morning and say, I'm going to teach you the meaning, that is the sense of the name Phosphorus. It stands for that star, which is the last one to disappear in the morning sky. And then they would take them out in the evening and say, I'm going to teach you the name, the meaning, that is the sense of the name, they'd all read Frege, of the name Hesperus. It's that star which is the last star, or the first star to appear in the evening sky. And my knowledge of Babylonian is based on Wikipedia. Okay, and then a genius Babylonian astronomer discovers that there's just one planet. And he announces somewhere, yes, 2. And everybody is amazed, and they learn something. They learn something from his saying 2 that they would have not learned from his saying 1, namely that the last planet to disappear in the morning sky is the first planet to appear in the evening sky. So that's the second problem. And his solution to the 2 is interlocked. By learning about names and attaching senses to them, you learn about facts. It's a beautiful theory with only one slight problem. Why, when you say A double sign A equals B, do you think A 3 sign B? I mean, what is the connection between the original meaning that didn't really seem to work the way it should and the new meaning a relation between signs that does do what it should. There's kind of a gap there. Okay, but it should not be sneered at, as he did. I mean, how do we get from 1 and 2, that's with the identity sign, to 3 and 4? Well, he never really says. And once he gets into Begriffsschrift, he kicks out the identity sign, so he doesn't have the problem anymore. But it looks like he's saying, well, this is what you really have in mind. And he uses a phrase like that in looking back on his theory and on sense and reference. So it was just kind of a magical step, but seems kind of right. So, well, what people use the identity sign, what it really means is identity, but what they have in mind is co-signification. That, plus the bifurcation of his theory, makes it not the world's most beautiful theory. But in addition, there is a problem that he discovered about 15 years later on function and concept. If you take Hesperus as the second planet from the sun, Phosphorus is the second planet from the sun, you learn different things from those. Actually, again, in 2 levels. From the first, you can learn that the name Hesperus names a planet that is the second planet from the sun. You can't learn that from 6, and vice versa. You can learn that about phosphorus from 6, but you can't learn it from 5. And then if you know the senses of those, you can learn astronomical facts, and you haven't met this famous earth-shattering Babylonian astronomer yet, so you don't know that Hesperus is phosphorus. You can learn something from 5, namely that the first planet in the night sky is the second planet from the sun, that you can't learn from 6, and something from 6, namely that the last planet to disappear from the morning sky is the second planet from the sun. Now, if you learn them both, you could use logic to deduce. But anyway, so that's a problem, and that is not solved by this Section 8 theory. Section 8 theory, it sounds penal, doesn't it? By this Section 8 theory, because we don't have the right kind of sentence. We don't have an identity sentence or something that looks like an identity sentence. We just have a regular predication. So in this context, Section 8 doesn't apply, and so you don't have an explanation. So it's not a problem-free thing, but it's certainly not what he says he said in the Begriffsschrift, where he says, in my Begriffsschrift, I assume the latter, that identity was related to names or signs of objects. He just does not do that. As I say here, succinctly, no, he didn't. He distinguishes between identity, a relation between a thing and itself, and identity of content, a relation between signs. Then he goes on in a way that is kind of amazing, given this is the most read paragraph by the most respected philosopher of language in the 20th century, probably, to utter a number of sentences that make no sense whatsoever, in my humble opinion. He says, but this is arbitrary. In that case, the sentence A equals B would, he used a very obscure German word there, which I translated as WU. Would not longer, refer to its subject's matter. We did a lot of drinking yesterday after Yosu's oral, and that's the only explanation I have here. Huh? Why not? What does the arbitrariness have to do with it? I mean, well, I don't know what else to say. It just seems like a non sequitur. I mean, suppose that we arbitrarily call the morning star Frederica and the evening star Maria, name it after a hurricane, a very destructive hurricane. Yeah, I would be embarrassed to have the name Maria these days. So it's totally arbitrary, right? And I come in and I say, what are you guys doing? He said, well, we just decided to name the same object arbitrarily Maria and, what was the other name? Frederica. Frederica. Well, have I learned something? Yes. Is it useful? Potentially. I said, okay, tell me more about them. And they say, oh, Frederica is the last star to disappear in the morning, and Maria is the first star to appear in the evening. So if you, when I said in, you'd say, we've just decided that Frederica is Frederica, and then you told me the senses of Frederica and Maria, I wouldn't have learned anything. But instead, you told me something that admittedly had no scientific import when you told me. It was just that two arbitrary names referred to the same thing. You just decided that arbitrarily. But still, that combined with what you told me next, namely the senses of those arbitrary names, I would learn something. I wouldn't have. So he's just, as far as I can see, wrong. And then he elaborates in a way that just gets more and more confusing. If the sign A is distinguished from the sign B, the ghost of Michael Dummett just left the room, and it was very angry. Because we do not criticize. If the sign A is distinguished from the sign B only as object, only as object, only as object, only as object. He was somewhat repetitive sometimes. ... not as sign, i.e. not by the manner in which it designates something. The cognitive value of A equals A becomes essentially equal to that of A equals B, provided A equals B is true. So he's not saying they're meaningless because he's saying provided one of them is true. But he's saying, and this is just denying his first problem. He's just saying they're equal, but you said in the Begriffsschrift you could learn about the names from the one and not from the other. Well, I guess I was wrong then, but I'd rather not elaborate because I'm in a hurry. A difference can arise only if the difference between the signs corresponds to a difference in the mode of presentation of that which is designated. This just isn't right, as the example I just gave shows. You can learn something useful if I tell you A equals B, even if you don't know whether A and B are planets or hurricanes or islets in the Canary Islands. Islets, is that what they are? I don't know. But you can store that away. I mean, when you do crossword puzzles, you often do this. You know, you find out that two names, you don't know who either of them are, and you don't read enough in the Wikipedia article to find out much about them, but you find out they co-refer, that's irrelevant, because Frege did not work crossword puzzles, actually. Okay. Now, why does he give us this odd story that rejects the problem that motivated the Begriffsschrift, which he just told us a falsehood about? Well, my answer is he does not have a solution in on sense and reference to the original problem. There's nothing in the sense and reference theory that explains how, when I tell you Hesperus is Phosphorus, you learn that Hesperus and Phosphorus co-refer. Because, well, I always have to look, see if I do it on the next slide before I make it up. No. Okay. Yeah, yes I do. Okay. The content of Hesperus and Phosphorus in on sense and reference is now a thought with a capital T, a Gedanken, not an episode in the mind, but an entity in the third realm of abstract objects. Often translated as proposition, but the word proposition is almost always misleading. So I'm just going to call it the thought with a capital T. And the thought expressed is made up of the senses of the names. So the thought expressed is that the first planet to appear in the evening is the last planet to disappear in the morning. Now that thought gives you no information about names. Matter of fact, somebody, instead of saying Hesperus is Phosphorus, could say the first planet to appear in the evening is the last planet to disappear in the morning, and they would have told you the same thing, but they wouldn't have told you anything about names. He simply does not have a solution to his original problem. So he said it wasn't really a problem. Russell said you can't get back from reference to sense. That's important. I'm not sure I remember why right this minute. But you also can't get back from sense to name. So my hypothesis, at some level, Frege realized he wasn't solving the first problem, so he denied there was a problem. I don't mean he was dishonest. I mean, you know, come on, the guy's revolutionizing logic, you know, having problems with his kids. Russell's finding a contradiction, although he didn't know that anyway. But at some level, he kind of said, I got to give up on that problem. Maybe it's not really there. But actually, I believe, on both theories, he has solutions to all of the four problems. What are the four problems? Hesperus and Phosphorus. Hesperus and Phosphorus, you still learn about names. You don't learn from Hesperus. Hesperus and Phosphorus, you learn about astronomical facts. If you know the senses, you don't learn from Hesperus. The problem he couldn't solve, Hesperus is the second planet of the sun. You learn something different than Phosphorus, the second planet from the sun. And whatever the fourth problem. Yeah, the fourth problem is, the third problem is Hesperus is the second planet from the sun. You learn something about the name Hesperus. It stands for the second planet from the sun. You don't learn from Phosphorus, the second planet from the sun. And fourthly, if you know the senses, you learn something astronomical from the one, namely that the first planet to appear in the evening is the second planet from the sun, blah, 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 blah. So four problems. He has solutions to all of them without section 8. Why doesn't he realize that he has solutions? Are you ready? Because he believes in the doctrine of unique semantic content. Now, he may have gotten this from Avicenna by way of Sigvart, but there's no reason to think anything like that is true or even makes sense. And besides, I do not do that kind of research. So I'm not saying he made it up. It's probably there in the medievals or maybe Exodus. Is that something God said to Noah? Yeah.
I think it's the 11th.
Yeah. Beware of whales, and there's only one semantic content for any sentence. You can't find it in the Christian Bible because it's been very influenced by. What did you give me last night, Yosu? Why am I completely bizarre? Oh, wait. One is the doctrine of unique semantic content. Semantic content of an utterance are its truth conditions. That's what I mean. What's what I mean by semantic content? Truth conditions. As opposed to pragmatic, which I'm not going to discuss the word. It was completely and thoroughly analyzed in critical pragmatics. Nothing more ever needs to be said about the subject. The semantic contents of an utterance are its truth conditions. That's just how I'm using the term, these some definitions, i.e. necessary and sufficient conditions of the truth of the utterance. And I like to say utterances because I like thinking about dexicality and stuff, but actually for this talk, just sentences, because Frege's Begriffsschrift and on sense and reference don't contain any attention to context sensitivity. So we just take it to be the sentence. We don't have to take it to be the sentence token, just the sentence. There's no ambiguity, no context sensitivity, but I like to say utterance because it sounds deep. Now, what I mean by the semantic cognitive significance of an utterance is what a sincere and semantically competent speaker has to believe, and what a credulous and semantically competent hearer or reader can learn, however inept in every other area of life they may be. So, for example, David and I and Kepa and Yosu and Joanna and Maria and we're all eating dinner. And Kepa says, my steak needs more salt. Now, to sincerely say that, given his excellent semantic competence in English, he has to believe that his steak needs more salt. And if David, similarly, or possibly even a little better in his English semantic competence, or maybe not, hears him and believes what he says is true, he will have to believe that Kepa's steak needs more salt. Now, if in addition, contrary to fact, David has some low degree of social aptitude, he will realize, he will infer that Kepha probably said that for a reason, namely that he wanted someone to pass him the salt. But that belief is not part of David's semantic, whatever I said, competence. That's not part of the cognitive significance of what Kepha said. It might be part of the pragmatic significance, but I'm not going to qualify this by cognitive significance. I will mean semantic cognitive significance. What a socially inept but semantically competent person will believe. Okay. Now, a reminder of the Begriffsschrift, but he uses reference in the Begriffsschrift for this level, things, relations, and circumstances, and then he uses reference in on sense and reference for really the level of extensions, objects, sets, and truth values, although you always have to put an asterisk by extensions because he had, set theory was not officially established, had his own version, and David knows something about it, so if you don't put the asterisk, he'll make snarky comments. So anyway, so I'm going to call this subject matter, which is a slightly persuasive definition because I think that's the level that is intuitively the level of subject matter. We're interested in things, relations, and whether the things do or do not stand in the relations. That's what we're usually interested in. That's what the information we're usually trying to convey is, but that's an aside. That's not. And then if we also retire the word reference from the second theory, we get, call it sense and extension, and so there we have two levels, three levels if you include names. Got the asterisk there by sets. Okay, just reminding you how it works. Now let's go back to the Begriffsschrift, and let's do something that Frege doesn't explicitly do, but he was one of the first to obviously think clearly about, namely the difference between syntax and semantics, and the difference between what we might call now lexical semantics and compositional semantics. And because he gives us the answers to the questions. So remember, we've got just these two levels. So what the lexicon has to tell us is which things the names stand for, and which relations the relation words stand for. And then that, together with the compositional semantics, will tell us which circumstances the sentences stand for. It's all pretty clear. So let's say, and by the way, I'm inconsistent here because it's easiest to spell it out with F parentheses C, but it's easiest to do this with quotes is a planet, end quote, so give me a break. So we'll say in the lexicon, is a planet stands for the property of being a planet. Phosphorus stands for the last, now, here I'm giving you a choice. In the Begriffsschrift, it will just say phosphorus stands for Venus. That will be the information. It may get there by giving you the mode of determination but the fact here is that phosphorus stands for a certain planet, Venus. Of course, on sense and reference, when you look at lexicon for that, the last part won't be there. It'll just be the sense, okay. Hesperus stands for the first celestial object, and we're ignoring section 8. I'm claiming he can solve all of his problems without this funny section 8. So 2 bars just stands for identity. Compositional, and here's where I'm inconsistent, sorry, but phi of alpha, is that a phi? Phi of alpha is true if and only if the object that alpha stands for has property phi stands for, or in his patois of the Begriffsschrift, phi of alpha stands for the circumstance that the object, yeah, true if and only if, yeah, okay, that's a little misleading. She's true if and only if, and the stands for the circumstances is to replace is true if and only if. Right, and the circumstance can either be a fact or not a fact. Circumstances are not true or false. They're facts or not facts. And then the relational one, and I allow it, like phi alpha beta or alpha phi beta, because with the identity sentence, we usually put the identity sign in the middle. It's true if and only if stands for the circumstance the objects that alpha and beta stand for stand in the relation that phi stands for. So that's what you know. If you know the compositional semantics, you look at a new sentence in the Begriffsschrift, you've fallen asleep, he's writing it on the blackboard, you're not sure what the signs stand for, but if it's of that form, you know it's truth conditions in this sense. If you were to spell it out, you'd use some existential quantifiers if Frege had existential quantifiers, which he really doesn't, but he does have a rather complex notation, but I am digressing. You'd say, Frege, so Frege's the teacher, and he puts up this formula, and he says, David, under what conditions is that true? And you panic because you don't remember what he said alpha and beta and phi stood for, and then it occurs to you, that's true if the relation phi stands for holds between the objects that alpha stands for and the object that beta stands for. And Frege says, he's taken aback a minute and he says, I guess that's okay. And then David says, and you can also get a good deal on insurance at Geico. This is only funny if you listen to American TV. And Frege says, absolutely right, give that man a gerbil, or whatever it is. Get-go, yeah. Okay. Now, I want to say that just given the Begriffsschrift language, we can actually distinguish between 3 levels of truth conditions. First is the reflexive. That's what David used to answer the question. 2, we're going to Hesperus identity sign Phosphorus, right? So this is of the form ARB. So David hasn't been listening. He doesn't know what the identity stands for, or Hesperus stands for, or Phosphorus stands for, but he can say 2 is true if and only if there is an object X and an object Y in relation R, such that Hesperus stands for X, Phosphorus stands for Y, and the identity stands for R. And X has R to Y. That is correct. Check it out. Use the back of your handout. If those conditions are met, it will be true. And you say, well, but that's not what Keppa told me the truth conditions of a sentence are. Well, it probably is what he told you the truth conditions of a sentence are. But anyway, okay. So then we have the referential. Now let's go look at the lexicon. David kind of Frege looks away, and David looks at his notes. And now he knows that Hesperus stands for Venus, and Phosphorus stands for Venus, and the identity stands for identity. And so Frege turns back and says, can you tell me more? And David says, oh yes, it's true if and only if Venus is Venus. And Frege says, that's better. Maybe he does. So this is what I call a referential, or subject matter truth conditions. So notice these conditions put conditions on the names, not on the objects. Just like the 3 bars.
No.
Am I right?
No, you're just showing yourself to be socially inept.
Oh, why?
Because you poke the screen of your laptop.
You're not supposed to do that?
You're not supposed to.
Oh. But it's not my laptop, so it's okay.
Then it's okay.
Right.
Unless it's okay.
These are conditions on the subject matter. So we got truth conditions, 2 different truth conditions on different things. How can one sentence have 2 different truth conditions? Answer, they're consistent, right? What are the conditions for getting from Donostia, to Bilbao? You have to go on the highway that connects Donostia and Bilbao. Okay, that's true. What is the highway that connects Donostia and Bilbao? Keppa.
826 or something?
8. Yeah, you have to go on the A8. Well, those are different conditions. But they're consistent because you get from the one to the other by instantiating the implicit existential quantifier, right? How do you get from Danas to Bilbao? Well, there exists an X, such as X, a highway that goes from Danas to Bilbao, and you take it. Okay, given that that highway is A8 or whatever it was, how do you get from Danas to Bilbao? You go on A8. Consistent, but different. Same with truth conditions. But now, are you ready? We've got a third truth condition, the hybrid truth condition. You don't take all the information from the lexicon, you just take that, the identity sign stands for identity, and not the lexical facts about names. Now what are the truth conditions for the sentences? Just what Frege thought they were once he translated them into the 3-bar notation. 2 is true if and if there are X and Y, such as Hesperus refers to X and Phosphorus refers to Y, and X is identical with Y. So you get information about Hesperus and Phosphorus. No translation into 3 bars, no bifurcation of meaning, which is now illegal in most parts of Germany, actually. And one is true if there are X and Y, and Hesperus refers to X, and Hesperus refers to Y, and X identical with Y. So you get different information. He didn't need section 8. Well, here's a bonus. Remember the thing he couldn't solve that he came up with in function and concept, or concept and function and concept? It works fine for that too. I leave that as an exercise to the here, right? But at the reflexive level, they're different, and at the hybrid level, they're different, but at the referential level, they're the same, or the subject matter, they're the same. Now, none of you would say this, but lesser minds might say, but that's not fair. You have to make up your mind. Which proposition is expressed? This is what Frege spent the 12 years between the Begriffsschrift, the nonsense and reference, trying to decide, because he thought he had to decide. Why? Because he held the doctrine of unique semantic content. Maybe not even formulating it. Which proposition is expressed? Which thought is expressed, he would say? That the names Hesperus and Hesperus co-refer, or that the object Hesperus is identical one and the same with the object Phosphorus? Are we talking about names or things? The complaint derives from the doctrine of unique content. And you might say, well, at this point, shouldn't he consider the arguments for the doctrine of unique content? Probably. But I can't think of any. I mean, it's a picture, not a doctrine. It's a picture, I say it in the Nebraska way, picture, that the attitudes and saying, these sentence embedding things, are relations between agents and times and something. States of affairs in the Begriffsschrift, thoughts on sense and reference, infinite sets of infinitely complex and infinitely implausible possible worlds for David Lewis. It's a picture, but it's a picture that makes no sense, because these things are all abstract objects, and beliefs are part of the causal world. They're caused by things, and they cause you to do things. The right way to look at those abstract objects is that they're ways of keeping track of the truth conditions of beliefs and utterances, not objects that are constitutive of the state of affairs, using that, or the event or the episode of having a belief. Okay, that's about all I'm going to say about that. So the complaint derives from, the answer is we're using the names to talk about things. That's what we're doing, perfectly clear. The truth is the sentence puts conditions on both names and the things. We can get at different but consistent conditions by varying what we take as given and what else has to be true. Any of the what else answers, so I say, well, given that that's a sentence in Frege's Begriffsschrift, what else has to be the case for it to be true? Well, the predicate sign has to stand for something, and the name has to stand for something, and the other name has to stand for something, so that what the name stands for has the relation the predicate stands for to what the other name stands for. That's what else has to be true. Okay, now I'll give you a little more information. Hesperus stands for Venus, and Phosphorus stands for Venus, and identity stands for identity. Now what else has to be true? Venus has to be Venus, right? So it's the what else question. So any of the what else answers can be the cognitive or part of it for any speaker or listener. So you don't have to find what the listener learns in what we call the proposition expressed, or what is said, this unique thing that we think is going to that's just not the way it works. Otherwise, how would you ever teach language? I mean, you have a kid, you give him a steaming hot bowl of kale, and you say, have some kale. You don't mention it, you don't use quotes. You just say, that's kale, or I'm giving you some kale. And they will learn that the name of that is kale. And they will also learn that they hate kale. Now, I can explain the first. The second needs no explanation. And when the guy says, okay, now, if you have A equals B, or A identity sign B, then you can substitute A for B. Huh? But I mean, how am I supposed to substitute, how am I supposed to substitute Venus? I mean, I can't even see Venus most of the time. No, I mean the name, you can substitute the names. Well, how come I can substitute the name? Because it's not about names. You want to pass this class or not? So it's solved by brute force. Not any improvement on anything Frege ever said. But the reason it makes sense is because obviously if it's the same reason that most kids, if they actually read on sense and reference, kind of are perplexed. They say, well, but I mean, what's the problem between Hesperus and Phosphorus and Hesperus and Hesperus? The names are different. You can see that the names are different. And then the professor will explain why that's an improper answer and they're not profound enough. Because, but actually that's the right answer, in my humble opinion. So in the Begriffsschrift, Frege's choice of unique semantic content for sentences is what I'm calling subject matter circumstances, states of affairs. And he can't find any information about the names there. And he realizes that. So he says, well, it's a different state of affairs than the one you might have thought, and it does contain information about names because it's about names. An honest approach. On sense and reference, Frege's choice of unique semantic content is thoughts. What are thoughts? Well, I think they're kind of just what we call qualitative propositions, not singular propositions. I suspect they amount to complicated Ramsey sentences about the instantiation and co-instantiation and subsumption and co-subsumption of concepts. But one thing we know about senses is that anything one says about Frege's theory of sense, someone else, probably from Oxford, will disagree with. So that's all I'm going to tell you. But they're clearly necessary, whatever else they are, whatever cosmic significance they may have, whatever they provide necessary and sufficient conditions for the truth of things. So in sense and reference, Frege's choice of unique semantic content was thoughts. Senses of sentences that are built up out of the sentences of the parts of sentences. You can't find information about names there either. Well, I mean, maybe you can if you're talking about names, but I mean, you can't in just an ordinary sentence that uses names. So he decides a little less straightforwardly, in my opinion, than in the Begriffsschrift, that it wasn't really a problem. Now, one final point. I think it's the last point. No, it's not the last point. Well, it's almost the last point. Frege could simply have added the level of sense to the Begriffsschrift. Would have been made perfectly good sense on my perspective, which I call the reflexive referential theory or the critical referentialist theory. Do I have any other names for it so far? Yeah. Distinction between the proposition created and the proposition expressed. I don't know. So you can see that the level of subject matter, what he calls reference in the Begriffsschrift, but I've relabeled it subject matter because he uses reference, is a hybrid of sense and what he calls reference in sense and reference that I'm calling extension because the word reference just gets overused. So here's how you could combine them. So you've got three levels. You've got expressions, names, relation words, and sentences. You just say, okay, Frege, I believe you, whatever, you know, whatever Kripke's problems and Dinellan's problems and Kaplan's problems, we'll deal with them later. We'll assume every expression has a sense. And for names, it's an individual synod, that is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that picks out an individual. For relation words, it's just the relation. He says on function and concept, I'm adopting an extensionless program in logic, but the level of sense gives intentionless logicians everything they need. Concepts are at the level of sense. Now this led people to think, well, he didn't make the sense reference distinction for concepts, but he did. The sense of a concept is the property that you might associate with the concept or the concept, and the reference is the extension. So he does make the distinction. So, and says, so to get the subject matter level, you quantify over the senses of individual things, but you take the relation itself, and that gives you a circumstance. So to understand what the subject matter level of content of Hesperus is the second planet from the sun, you say, well, it's true given that Hesperus refers to Venus, right? If and only if there is a sense associated with, I didn't say this quite right. It's true at the subject matter level, if and only if there is a sense associated with Hesperus, and that sense determines, you don't know what sense it is, you're quantifying over it, that sense determines an object, and there is a sense associated with is the second planet from the sun, which is, in fact, you do know, the property being the second planet from the sun, and whatever that object is that's determined by the sense has the property. That's the level of subject matter, which I claim is the level at which we usually operate.
So this is actually a serious clarificatory question. Is it the same element in the cell, as it were, under relation words for both Sinnet and subject matter?
Yes.
Are those the same thing?
Yes. See, this is a hybrid level. From the point of view of the theory of sense and reference, you've got these two levels, and then you say, I say you get this level for free by quantifying over this one, but just taking this one.
I would have, okay.
Because I mean, you just got what Frege gives you. What Frege gives you are just this and this. So you've got the relation and the set. You don't want the set in the circumstance.
So I agree with that, but okay.
If you think of the sense of a relation word as an additional set of properties that a property has to have to qualify as a relation word, then you're thinking in a very reasonable way, but as far as I can tell, that's not what Frege is thinking of.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So that is, I'm doing a search.
Yeah, okay. So now I claim that this is usually, and I claim, and Frege seemed to think in the Begriffsschrift, this is the natural level at which we operate.
I agree with that.
Yeah. And if it turns out that their Sinne is not as clear a concept and is not a pervasive feature as Frege thought, which is what the direct reference people say, that would explain why we don't usually deal with this level. Now Frege distinguished between complete languages, which is what he was interested in and what he wanted the Begriffsschrift to be, and incomplete languages, which is what he thought natural languages were. Incomplete languages often have names that have a sense with no reference, and they often do not have a shared sense among all the people that use them, who nevertheless, Frege says, somewhat disappointedly, do fine. This is in his footnote on Aristotle. So Maria believes that Aristotle was the...
On Aristotle.
On quote Aristotle. Yeah, Maria believes the sense of Aristotle is the student of Plato's who taught Alexander the Great. Kava believes that the sense of Aristotle is the smartest guy ever born in Stagira, or something like that. They do fine. Why do they do fine? Well, because they're not trying to prove anything, they're not doing math, they're not doing serious science. They communicate tolerably well, is essentially what he says. Well, I just point out, look, Frege, that's the language that the attitude reports occur in, right? Maybe you've got proves that, not in your theory, but in somebody's theory. And that might be interesting, but believes that, says that, hopes that. There are all part of incomplete languages, which means you cannot assume that there is a shared sense. And that's why this is the level that's important. And once you realize that, you can forget this indirect reference stuff, and we can forget most of the philosophy of language of the 20th century. And that's what I have to say.
Oh, exactly.
But not all of the you should still what is information, critical pragmatics, reference, a couple of things that somehow manage to survive. Okay, questions, comments, refutations, conjectures, defenses of dumb. Yes, arrows.
Just out of curiosity.
Out of curiosity. Why would I believe such a stupid thing? No, I'm just kidding. No.
Well, you got a gamut ghost going out. Let's get A1's ghost coming in now.
No.
And what would
He's talking about Gareth Evans, dumbest student who had lots of opinions on these matters.
What would you say to A1 if you would say what when you subsume, when you group together, you add the two-stroke with the three-stroke in your intermediate context. And this is just a notational variant of it.
Just a notational variant of.
Okay.
No, wait, when I do what?
When you say what Frege in paragraph 8,
Yeah.
you distinguish between the identity and the three-stroke reference. And you say you can't get rid of A because I bring in what's called order in your three-level count. You got, and so you can get rid. And A1 will say, A1's code, this is just a notational variant of Frege.
Well, he's wrong.
I know, I'm curious to hear what you
Because Frege gives us two candidates for the what sentences stand for: states of affairs and thoughts. Neither of them so I guess first I'd say, well, what do you mean notational variant? What is the notation that I'm using?
I was just repeating what you say about Frege and demonstratives.
Yeah, well, of course, Frege and demonstratives is a little bit different there. What Evans says on Frege and demonstratives, which is a paper I wrote, and this brilliant young philosopher, well, he's no younger than me at the time, replied with all kinds of objections and said the world will have to meet a more profound philosopher from the West Coast before it pays any attention to that miserable hunk of land. I'm slightly exaggerating what he said. But he says things that are just not true about Frege, because Frege is clear that objects are not part of senses, and he is clear that thoughts have one truth value, irregardless of the person who grasps the thought or the time at which they grasp it. I claim you can't, so the relation is here that Frege in on sense and reference is essentially, of course, dealing with senses and extensions. I claim he needs subject matter in Frege on demonstratives. And I claim he needs subject matter because when you deal with indexicals, you don't get a sense. You just get a rule that takes you from the expression and the context to the object. So Frege's theory is not a notational variant of that view, although I present that view as a friendly amendment to Frege. Evans' own view, which he thinks because he uses the lambda calculus must be Fregean, essentially just because I think it's that onslaught of nuclear weapons that Korea launched against California today has screwed things up. So in his lambda calculus reinterpretation of what Frege meant that my criticisms isn't touch, he actually gives us circumstances. He gives us things that are the references of sentences with objects in them. So, you know, he's a brilliant guy, and student of Dummett's had all kinds of advantages I didn't have, knew David as a student, but as far as I can see, it just was right. He had some good ideas because he saw that, you know, to talk about tracking and so forth, he was going to need more in his theory. But he wouldn't accept that what I suggested was somehow no more problematic than what he suggested. Then he went on in his career, and it turns out that even though Frege says that there can be names with sense and no reference maybe 6,000 times in his works, since that he didn't really believe that. He thought there at least were some names that had to have a reference. Now, I think Frege probably should have believed that. Because if you think about Frege's theory of proper names, it's kind of weird. So you say, well, the only examples he gives are the ones in footnote 6. He mentions 5 proper names in on sense and reference. Aristotle, Kepler, Vulcan, Odysseus, and I don't know, Hiram, his butcher or something. The Aristotle ones are cases of incomplete language. But at least he tells us what the senses that aren't shared are, and they look like definite descriptions, like the brightest guy ever to come from Stagira. So you might think, well, that's the condition that is associated with Aristotle and could have been the condition associated by everybody, but it can't be because it's got Stagira in it. And a sense can only have a sense, so it has to have a sense of Stagira in it. So what's the sense of Stagira going to be? The city just well, that would no the city destroyed by who was Alexander's father? Philip, yeah, Philip II. That's why Aristotle went to teach Alexander so he could persuade Philip to rebuild Stagira. Whether he didn't have any kind of education at Berkeley, what are they, just kind of comic books, that kind of shit? But then you've got Philip in the sense of Stagira. So you have to have a sense of Philip. So it looks like there has to be a terminal point, something like Russell's theory of logically proper names, but Frege never says anything like that. So give Evans some hagiographic credit. He's trying to find something that might solve a real problem, but I can't see the textual evidence. Frege at one point introduces mock names. And what he has in mind is fiction. And he's kind of like, he's mad at fiction. Because it's just an irritating problem that's been with him since on sense and reference. He wants to say that sentences with names that have no reference don't have a truth value. But then he has to give them a truth value because of his other principles, so they all have to stand for, I don't know, Caesar's earlobe or something. And the whole thing irritates him. And so he says, let's just call them mock names. Evans, McDowell group kind of say, oh, well, this shows that all along he really didn't think that names without reference were real names. I don't think it shows that at all, in my humble opinion, humble as it is. So Evans, great mind, great insights, varieties of reference, a must read, and I did read it, and I don't intend to do it again. Then there's McDowell, who wrote this snarky little essay called The Sense and Reference of Proper Names, in which he kind of said, well, there's all these, see, I guess I'm a little paranoid. All these American non-Oxford types criticizing Frege. The only one that's got anything right is Tyler Burge. And then but he has the same picture of mock names and all that stuff that Evans does. And according to David, who was there at the time, he was the ringleader.
Yes, that was my sense.
Yeah. Okay. But what was your reference?
I do have a couple of questions. One, I think
You have questions?
yeah.
You gonna tell me you don't believe
I
this?
think there is a problem, examples 5 and 6.
5 and 6.
I told you, but anyway.
5 and 6. Is that the one about second plan from the same?
There is Hesperus and then is and then a definite description. So it seems that you can have identity there.
Oh.
According to Frege. If definite descriptions are names. Well, so, so 5 and 6, yeah. It's a big second class. It's a
Yeah.
big second class, so it would be a relation between names, identity.
Oh, yeah, so it's not a very good example. Yeah, actually, in a later version of the earlier version of which this was the last version, I just changed it to Hesperus is a planet. But somehow I didn't get that into this for just that reason. Frege's theory of definite descriptions, by the way, really becomes a thing of beauty when you reinterpret it in my way. Why? I don't know if I can say, but maybe I can. Or should I? Or should I just let you ask your next question? For essentially the reason that it works like we said definite descriptions work in critical pragmatics. Yeah, so you have the so-and-so, and the question is, well, at this level, is the so-and-so going to be the state of errors involving the thing that is the so-and-so? So the so-and-so is such and such. So is that going to be the state of affairs of the thing that is so-and-so being such and such? Or is it going to be the state of affairs of so-and-so-ness being coinstantiated with such and suchness? And it's a forced choice if you have the doctrine of unique content. So Russell chooses, the circumstance of coinstantiation. Strawson, I guess, the circumstance of the object having the property. But they're both there. The conditions for both are there. There's just different hybrids. You need a little few more, and there's lots of so Frege. I mean, talk about stuff that everybody reads that really no one understands. Russell's criticisms of Frege's theory of descriptions.
Gray's elegy?
Yeah. Well, the Gray's elegy thing.
Understands that.
I'm on the verge of understanding it. But, yeah, anyway. So Russell thought that Frege's treatment of definite description, which of course was 15, 20 years before, on sense and ref was 1892, on denoting was 1905, so I guess 13 years before, was inconsistent. And I think the inconsistency had to do with Frege getting both readings. Because Frege typically says, Russell thought that proper names were hidden definite descriptions, but what Frege actually seems to say is that definite descriptions are proxies for names. He doesn't quite say that either. But he seems to get both the reference into the picture at the level of extension, but then, you know, when they work with other, as we now say, quantifying phrases, he's not just thinking about the reference. So I think that plus some experience Russell had in a graveyard, if I can just figure that out, I'll be able to figure out that argument. Oh, what was your next question?
Yeah, well, I think I know the answer to that.
Of course you do.
About the model profile or whatever of A equals B equals A. I mean, in Frege's paragraph, we have that A equals B is synthetic,
Yeah.
or informative, blah, blah, blah. While the other one is analytic, non-informative,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. But now it seems that from your view, we have the same utterance can be analytical at some level,
Yeah.
non-informative at the referential level, and informative at the reflexive level or the hybrid level, right? So
Yeah.
you would say that A equals B is both analytic and synthetic, or is
Well,
how would you put that?
how would I put that? Well, so at the level, so let's think of a good example. What's a good example? Hesperus.
Robert A. Zimmerman and Bob Dylan. You didn't like that?
Well, I don't know. Let's just take Hesperus. Hesperus is the first, no, well, I got a definite description. Let's say Hesperus appears early in the evening. That's true. Now, since its sense is being the first planet to appear in the evening, I guess there's a little room for, because the first planet to appear might be quite late, but forget about that. So you see, what feels analytic? Well, so analyticity would be an attribute of the truth conditions with the zina given, but the subject matter and the extension quantified over. At that level, analyticity makes sense. Necessary and contingent, to me, are properties of circumstances, not of sentences. What properties? Well, you know, I'm not that old, maybe I'll figure it out. But, you know, it's basically like puzzle pieces. If they, you know, they either fit together. If they can't fit together, then they're not possible. If they must fit together, I don't know, but it's different than analyticity. So Hesperus appears early in the evening, I would think, is not necessary, right? It probably, with climate change, it won't appear at all. Yes. And so I think, I mean, I don't have a well thought out views, but I think analyticity and whatever the opposite is, syntheticity, if they make any sense, and I'm glad they make some sense, belong at the level of zina or whatever we develop. There's got to be some connection between names and objects in relation. I'm not sure zina does it. Maybe it does it for complete languages. Maybe it does it in really nice cases. In some cases, it's just causal stuff. In some cases, it's consensus. And in some cases, I think just God decided, you know. But you can tell us more about that.
No, it's Adam.
Adam, oh yeah. Adam named things?
Adam named.
Well, there you are. And he was also a swarm in original sin.
Yeah.
So is it any wonder that philosophical language is such a mess?
Yeah. Said, as Einstein said.
Anyway, I'm wandering away from from Keppa's probing point. Okay, so yeah, I think if I were to think about analyticity and those issues, which I certainly should do, I think this would shed some light on it, but mostly by saying, well, analyticity is kind of obscure, but it belongs at whatever level should be there instead of zina, or as an expansion of zina, or a deeper understanding of zina, or an evansification of a dumbification of zina.
Just read Montague. I mean, forget all the fancy stuff.
Montague is stuck.
Analyticity, is that, you know, is that the
But he's stuck on Frege's detour. Montague really doesn't have circumstances, does he?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Would you
Hmm?
Frege's use of a priori a posteriori?
Yeah, so he has what he calls the epistemic value, which is a priori, a posteriori. And then analytic, synthetic, and then when he gets to things like, it's not really analytic, synthetic, it's just different beliefs, he calls it cognitive value or something. That's what I call cognitive significance. A priori, a posteriori, that has to do with knowledge, and I don't do knowledge. It's not much of an answer, is it? But I think a priori, a posteriori has to do with sentences, not facts, would be my guess. So you can know things a priori. So let's see, so Kripke's big problem is things that are synthetic, no, that's Kant, synthetic a priori.
Necessary a priori, necessary a posteriori.
Yeah.
Huh?
So Kripke has things that are a posteriori but necessary.
Yeah.
Lots of them.
Well, if a posteriori has to do with the level of Zinn, and necessary has to do with the level of circumstance,
That's
that
kind
makes
of the-
perfectly good sense.
Exactly, that's kind of the picture.
Yeah,
he's got.
yeah.
Like they want epistemological view.
Because, you know, well, I can't think of all the examples I can think of involve insulting David, and I don't want to do that. I couldn't know ahead of time that David was irritating, but I imagine if I knew his genetic makeup.
So, I think it's just,
Do you want something back up?
just a simple question. On your four-letter structure, what, model? Yeah. So
That one?
model presentation will be part of the same. right?
Mode of presentation? Yeah, to me, which is not the standard interpretation, but the mode of presentation would be a concept, right? And you get from a mode of presentation to a sense by filling in senses that determine the arguments. So a mode of presentation, on my view, is a function that takes you from arguments to the object it's a mode of presentation of. But the sense is not the mode of presentation plus arguments, it's the mode of presentation plus senses of the arguments, which is what may lead to the regress. Is that? So that would all be at this level or whatever ends up there, I guess.
Which is the way you would solve the problem of
Hmm?
synonyms.
What?
Which is the way you would go on to solve the problem of synonyms.
I would,
Not on married man, because stick with Frege, we would refer to the same concept, but Frege doesn't say much.
no, he doesn't say much about that, and you know, he might, so bachelor,
Does it say what we would express different senses?
yeah, I don't know, David, what do you
This
think?
gets back to the way, that's kind of the question I mean, so I don't know if you're doing, if you're pretending to do Frege scholarship or what. But anyway, I mean, the picture,
I have reread and reread and reread several paragraphs from Frege.
because, I mean, how shall I put it, the kind of official picture, which of course is not Frege's picture, because we all know, but the official picture that one got as an inheritance, as a child of the 50s and 60s and 70s, maybe 90s and 90s, was that with respect to relation words, let's just say concept words.
Concept words, yeah.
A simple case, right? That the extension, now for Frege, it's clear the extension isn't actually, like is a planar. Right? I think it's quite clear that for Frege, the extension isn't the set of planets. It's actually, and I think, and what he calls the course of values.
Yeah, and what is the course of values?
Which I think, I mean, it's a little, that's not completely clear, but the natural model for it is the set of ordered pairs.
Right.
Of things that have T T in the second
Yeah.
place.
The functions, it's a function from an object to a truth value.
It's only
And it-
of,
yeah,
no,
it's a
the
characteristic-
The extension is literally the result of applying the function. So in principle, it's got infinitely many, there are infinitely many ordered pairs, exactly 8 of which now, not 9, well, if we're talking about
Is a
things
planet,
of the
yeah.
sun, have T in their second position. The planets,
Right.
because one of them got thrown out.
And so the course of values,
Yeah, that's the course of values.
Yeah.
And then there's then there's whatever it is, the rule
that's the function in intention.
in the function.
Yeah, the course of values is a function, and then the function in intention would be
The rule.
the concept.
Yeah, the concept.
Yeah. And but intensions are properties and relations. People don't, who are raised these days, think they're functions from possible worlds of extensions. So, but you can look up like Church's definition in Roon's dictionary. They're properties and relations. That's what people meant by intentions from time immemorial, or at least a long time ago.
Anyway,
Yeah.
but so there would be.
Yeah,
this-
no, I think that's good. That's a good way of looking at it.
anyway.
So, yeah, because, I mean, I need to brush up on this, but set theory was in its infancy, not even quite in its infancy.
No, so Cantor, I mean, they're almost contemporary.
All these things are happening at the same time, yeah.
Frege and Cantor were essentially contemporary, but Cantor had a completely mathematical version of set theory, which is the one that we now, that's the one we have. Frege's didn't have set theory. Frege had a logical
Version of set theory,
version,
yeah.
which came, where the crucial thing first were, the crucial thing were kind of logical notions like concept, not like
Yeah.
collections. I mean, Cantor starts out with absolutely arbitrary collections where you don't know,
Yeah.
I don't know what puts these together. I mean, they're just a bunch of things. Anyway, so.
Yeah,
it's
so-
almost simultaneous.
Frege's is much more intuitive to me.
Well, Frege's is a logical conception.
Well, yeah, except that when looking back, people say, well, Frege thought he was a logicist, but really he was reducing mathematics to set theory.
Yeah,
But he had a pretty kind of logical version of set theory, and it all came a kipper with axiom 5.
exactly. The closest, well, there are almost no successors, in a way, to Frege. I mean, unless you think of the craziness in Quine's ML, mathematical logic, as a successor, or new foundations or something. Anyway, but there's really, I mean,
So where does this anti-foundationalism set theory fit in? Set theory without foundations, like Etchemendy and Barwise use.
oh no, that's
That's
a
very-
specific axiom.
Yeah,
That's got to do with-
that's just part of classical set theory
Right,
with a new
classical set
axiom, yeah, okay. Well, I would suspect Frege was onto something that maybe hasn't been quite figured out.
In terms of set theory, I don't think so.
Oh. Well, but concepts does seem like the right starting point.
If you want.
Properties and relations. See, that's the paradox about, well, I don't know.
Anyway. But,
A bit of paradox about
so
Frege
this
is,
is like, actually, I shouldn't have said what I said about no successor. That's actually false and true. Pfefferman.
oh,
So Pfefferman's set theories of concepts and operations on it. That's kind of Fregean. You know, that actually.
how about
is-
Zalta?
Well, no, that's, I mean, the head explodes, but. Anyway.
I don't know, it just seems
No,
kind
no, no,
of, seems very elegant, right? You have the abstract objects that
Yeah, no,
encode
Zalta
properties.
too. That's a logical, I mean, the notion of set is bizarrely derivative, just, oh, yeah, okay. You know. Those things are the same if they have the same members. I mean, that's
Yeah.
basically right. Yeah. So if you start
But-
off with these intentional notions in some intuitive sense, I'm not, never mind fancy, it's just intuitive. kind of
But
logic.
surely you would agree with the consensus now that it makes more sense to start off with extensions so that one thinks of a property as a a set of objects from infinity of possible worlds. Well, that's what Lewis thinks a property is. You've got an infinity of possible worlds, and then you got a set of objects that is all the objects in all the possible worlds, and that might turn out to be the property being read. To me, that's crazy. And it starts with this, what you call a Cantor picture of sets, and then, you don't think so? Okay, all right. Okay, somebody, besides these four people, does anybody born after 1900 have a question? Well then.
Thank you very much.